My stepmother called me a burden until she decided I was the key to saving her own family, and then Hey everyone, I feel like I've just stepped into a soap opera. My life was finally in a good place. I've got a steady job in marketing, apartment in Chicago, and my best friend, Mia, who keeps me grounded. Then, out of nowhere, she showed up. Cheryl, my stepmother. Or rather, my ex-stepmother, since my dad passed away 10 years ago and she remarried. She was the one person I swore I'd never see again. But of course, life had other plans. A little backstory. My mom died when I was 5, and my dad remarried Cheryl when I was 9. Cheryl wasn't some wicked stepmother in the fairy tale sense, but she sure wasn't warm and loving either. She had this way of making me feel like I didn't belong, like I was just this annoying leftover piece of my dad's past life she had to tolerate. Every little thing I did seemed to irritate her, and she never let me forget that I was a burden on her perfect little family. Then, when I was 17, my dad died of a sudden heart attack, and Cheryl practically shoved me out the door. I went to college on scholarships and part-time jobs, and that was the last I heard from her. Until last week, I was heading home from work, ready to crash after a long day, when I got a call from an unfamiliar number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but for some reason, I picked up. And there she was, Cheryl, her voice as polished and sweet as ever. Except this time, there was a desperation underneath it that made me pause. She said, "Olivia, it's Cheryl. I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you. It's about Caleb." Caleb is Cheryl's son, my half-brother. He was born when I was 10, and while I always tried to be a good sister to him, Cheryl made sure we weren't exactly close. Still, hearing his name tugged at something in me. I hadn't seen Caleb since he was a little kid. He'd be, 17 now? Practically an adult. I asked, "What's going on?" And Cheryl launched into this tearful story about how her life is falling apart. Her husband, Greg, who she married a couple of years after my dad died, is divorcing her. She's losing their house. And Caleb is apparently struggling in school and acting out, which Cheryl swears is because of all the upheaval in their lives. She said she's at her wit's end and doesn't know where to turn. I won't lie, I felt a flicker of sympathy at first. I mean, I wouldn't wish that kind of stress on anyone, not even Cheryl. But then she said something that set off alarm bells. She said, "I wouldn't have reached out if I didn't need your help. Caleb needs stability right now." And I thought, well, maybe you could help us out financially. I almost laughed out loud. This woman, who treated me like garbage for most of my childhood, was now asking me for money? The audacity was unreal. But I kept my cool and asked her why she thought I'd be in any position to help. That's when she dropped the bomb. She said, "I know things were hard between us, but I think your dad would want you to step up. Caleb is your brother, after all. And I have something to tell you about your father that I think you should know." I swear, my heart stopped for a second. My dad and I were close, but there were things he never talked about, especially when it came to his relationship with Cheryl. The idea that she might be holding on to some kind of secret about him made my stomach churn. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that Cheryl was just trying to manipulate me, like she always did. I told her I needed time to think and hung up before she could push me further. Then I called Mia, who was immediately ready to burn Cheryl to the ground. Mia's been my best friend since college, and she knows all about the history between me and Cheryl. Her advice was simple. Liv, don't trust her. She's playing you. Whatever secret she's dangling, it's probably a lie to get what she wants. And honestly, Mia's probably right. But there's a part of me that can't let it go. What if Cheryl really does know something about my dad that I don't? And then there's Caleb. He didn't do anything wrong. If he's really in trouble, do I have a responsibility to help him, even if it means dealing with Cheryl? The next day, I texted Cheryl and agreed to meet her for coffee. I figured I'd at least hear her out, if only to get some clarity. We met at this little cafe downtown, and the moment she walked in, I felt like I was 16 again, bracing myself for one of her passive-aggressive comments. But instead, she looked tired. Her usually perfect blonde hair was limp, and there were dark circles under her eyes. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. She wasted no time getting to the point. She told me that Greg's divorce lawyers were ruthless, and if they won, she'd be left with nothing. Caleb's private school tuition was already overdue, and without Greg's support, she wouldn't be able to keep him in school. She said she was trying to protect Caleb from the worst of it, but he was already acting out, skipping classes, getting into fights, and shutting her out completely. I asked her why she thought I'd be able to help, and her answer made my blood boil. She said, "You've always been so independent, Olivia. I figured you'd be in a good place by now. And besides, Caleb is family. I know things weren't perfect between us, but surely you care about him enough to help." The guilt trip was real. And then she hit me with the kicker. She said, "Your father wouldn't have wanted this. He worked so hard to build a good life for us, and now it's all falling apart. He'd want you to do the right thing." I could barely keep my voice steady when I told her, "You don't get to use my dad against me. Not after the way you treated me." Cheryl sighed, like she was the one who had the right to be frustrated, and said, "There's more to your father's story than you know. If you help us, I'll tell you everything." And just like that, I was hooked. I hate myself for it, but I need to know what she's hiding. Still, I'm not stupid. I told her I'd think about it, and left before she could say anything else. Now I'm sitting here, wondering what to do. I don't trust Cheryl as far as I can throw her, but I can't ignore the knot in my stomach every time I think about Caleb. If she's telling the truth, and he really is in trouble, how can I just turn my back on him? And what if there really is something I don't know about my dad? What would you do in my shoes? So, after my coffee meeting with Cheryl, I thought I'd have some clarity about what to do. Spoiler alert, I didn't. I was angrier, more confused, and more emotionally tied up than ever. I knew better than to trust her, but that little "I'll tell you everything about your father" line kept playing in my head like a broken record. I couldn't just let it go. Mia was not happy when I filled her in later that night. She practically spit out her wine and said, "This woman is trying to scam you, Liv. You know that, right? She's cornering you with Caleb and your dad to milk you for whatever she can get. It's manipulation 101. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. Cheryl had always been great at making herself sound like the victim, no matter the situation. I mean, growing up, she'd act like I was some ungrateful little brat if I so much as asked for a new pair of shoes for gym class. But then there was Caleb. I couldn't get him out of my head. Was it really fair to let him suffer because Cheryl was a walking train wreck? I decided I needed more information. If I was going to help, or not help, I wanted to know exactly what I was dealing with. So, I started digging. The first person I reached out to was James, my ex-boyfriend. You might be wondering what my ex has to do with any of this, and trust me, I didn't plan on getting him involved. But the thing is, James used to work as an accountant at Greg's company a few years ago. Back when we were dating, he used to complain about Greg and the mess that was Cheryl's social climbing lifestyle. He might know something. James and I hadn't talked much since our breakup, but we ended things on decent terms. I sent him a quick message asking if he'd grab coffee with me to catch up, and he agreed without hesitation. I didn't tell him about Cheryl right away because I wasn't sure how much I wanted to share. We met at a coffee shop, a different one, because I wasn't about to risk running into Cheryl again. He looked good, annoyingly good, honestly. Same easy smile, same charming energy that had drawn me to him in the first place. After some polite small talk about work and life, I finally bit the bullet. "Hey, random question," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you still keep up with Greg or Cheryl? You used to mention them sometimes." James raised an eyebrow. "Why are you asking about Cheryl?" "Well, she kind of reached out to me recently," I admitted. "She's apparently going through some big crisis, and she wants my help. I was just wondering if you'd heard anything about what's going on with them." James leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more serious. "I don't know much about what's happening now, but Greg's divorce has been a long time coming. When I worked there, their marriage was already on the rocks. Cheryl was always spending money like it grew on trees, and Greg got fed up with it. I'm pretty sure she was hiding debt from him, too." My stomach turned. That tracked with what Cheryl had said about losing everything, but it also made me wonder if she was even more desperate than she let on. "Did Greg ever mention Caleb?" I asked. Cheryl made it sound like Greg's cutting her off is going to ruin Caleb's life. James shook his head. Greg always seemed to like Caleb, but he was never super involved with him. Honestly, It wouldn't surprise me if Greg tried to keep some kind of support going for Caleb, even after the divorce. But for Cheryl? No way. She burned that bridge. After meeting with James, I felt more suspicious than ever. It sounded like Cheryl's financial situation was even worse than she'd admitted. If she really had been hiding debt from Greg, it explained why she was so desperate. But then why wasn't she going straight to Greg for help with Caleb? Was it because Greg didn't trust her anymore? And what exactly did she mean about my dad? I needed to know more. Against my better judgment, I texted Cheryl and asked if I could meet Caleb. I figured if anyone was going to give me an honest account of what was going on, it'd be him. Cheryl replied almost immediately, saying Caleb would be thrilled to see me and suggesting I come over to their house for dinner. Dinner at Cheryl's house. The thought alone gave me anxiety, but I agreed. If nothing else, I could finally talk to Caleb and see how much of Cheryl's story checked out. The house was smaller than I remembered. I guess I'd built it up in my head as this big, fancy place Cheryl had married into, but seeing it now, it just looked ordinary, like a home that had seen better days. The lawn was overgrown, and there was a crack in one of the front windows that no one had bothered to fix. It didn't scream wealthy family, that's for sure. Cheryl greeted me at the door with a wide smile, acting like we were best friends who hadn't seen each other in years. "Olivia, you look wonderful. Come in, come in." I gritted my teeth and stepped inside. The living room was cluttered with boxes, probably from the divorce, and Caleb was slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, I saw a flash of recognition in his face. Then he smiled, a little shyly. "Olivia," he said. "Wow, it's been, like, forever." "Yeah," I said, smiling back. "You've grown up a lot." Caleb looked older than I expected. Tall, a little lanky, with dark hair that kept falling into his eyes. He still had that same quiet energy I remembered from when he was a kid, but there was something else, too. He seemed tired, like he was carrying more than a 17-year-old should have to. Dinner was awkward, to say the least. Cheryl kept trying to steer the conversation to how hard things had been for her, but Caleb barely said a word. I finally turned to him and asked how he was doing. He shrugged. "It's whatever. School's fine. Mom's just stressed." Cheryl shot him a look, but I pressed on. "Are you still at the same school?" "Yeah," Caleb said, his tone flat. "For now, anyway. We're behind on tuition." I glanced at Cheryl, who gave me a tight smile. "It's been hard, but I'm doing everything I can to keep him there. He needs stability." After dinner, Caleb and I ended up talking alone in the living room, while Cheryl busied herself in the kitchen. He opened up a little more, telling me about how he'd been getting into trouble at school. Not because he didn't care, but because he felt like no one else did. He said Greg used to be more involved, but now he barely even spoke to him. I wondered if it was because of Cheryl. Maybe Greg thought she was manipulating Caleb, turning him against him, or using him as a pawn. Either way, it was clear Greg's distance was more about Cheryl than Caleb himself. "And Cheryl? She's always freaking out about money," he said. "It's all she talks about." It broke my heart a little, hearing him talk like that. He reminded me of myself at that age, just trying to survive, with no one really looking out for him. When I left that night, Cheryl pulled me aside and said, "See? Caleb needs you. I know you don't trust me, but this isn't about me. It's about him." The worst part? I couldn't tell if she was lying. Now I feel like I'm in deeper than ever. Caleb clearly needs someone, but how much of what Cheryl's saying is true? And if I help, am I just enabling her? I don't know what to believe anymore. After dinner at Cheryl's house, my head was spinning. Caleb's tired, defeated demeanor stayed with me, but so did Cheryl's manipulative smile and those not-so-subtle digs about me needing to step up. I kept asking myself, was Caleb just a pawn in her game? Was I walking right into one of her traps? Or was this actually about helping my brother? I spent the next couple of days replaying the whole evening in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that Cheryl was hiding something, but I didn't know what. My gut was telling me to dig deeper, so that's exactly what I did. The first clue came out of nowhere. I was sitting at my desk at work, drowning in emails, when I got a phone call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. "Hello, is this Olivia?" A polished, no-nonsense voice asked. My name is Victoria. I'm Greg's lawyer. Cue my heart dropping into my stomach. Victoria didn't waste time. I'm sorry to call you out of the blue, but I understand Cheryl has recently reached out to you. She paused before continuing. Greg asked me to inform you of what's happening. He thought you deserved to know the truth, especially since Cheryl has been trying to involve you in her financial issues. I wanted to give you a heads up about the situation you're walking into. Apparently, Cheryl's financial situation was even worse than she let on. According to Victoria, Greg had already agreed to provide support for Caleb as part of the divorce agreement, tuition, living expenses, the whole 9 yards. However, Cheryl was demanding additional funds outside of what was legally mandated, things like overdue private school tuition and emergency expenses that didn't fall under the original settlement terms. But Cheryl had been pushing for more, claiming she needed additional money to settle family debts. Victoria's team did some digging and found out Cheryl had been funneling money from joint accounts into a separate fund under her name. Not only that, but she maxed out several credit cards Greg didn't even know about. She's using Caleb as leverage to get sympathy from you, Victoria said bluntly. I thought you deserved to know that before you make any decisions. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Cheryl had painted herself as this desperate, struggling mother who was fighting to keep her son afloat. But if what Victoria said was true, then Cheryl had been lying to my face. And worse, she was dragging Caleb into it. Why are you telling me this? I asked. What do you want me to do? Victoria sighed. Honestly, I just don't want her to manipulate you. Greg doesn't want to cut Caleb off, but Cheryl's making things more difficult than they need to be. I've been dealing with her for months, and she has a way of twisting the truth to get what she wants. Be careful. When the call ended, I just sat there, staring at my computer screen. I should have felt vindicated. This confirmed everything Mia had warned me about. Cheryl was scheming, just like she always had. But instead of feeling relief, I felt this heavy, sinking guilt. What about Caleb? Did he even know what was happening? Or was Cheryl feeding him lies too? That night, I told Mia about the call. She looked about ready to throw hands. Liv, what more proof do you need? Cheryl's a fraud. You don't owe her or Caleb anything. I shook my head. It's not that simple. Caleb's a kid. He didn't ask for this. And if Greg's pulling back because of Cheryl's lies, Caleb's the one who's going to suffer. Mia rolled her eyes. You can't fix their family, Liv. Cheryl made her bed. Let her lie in it. She was right, logically. But logic wasn't exactly winning against my emotions right now. I needed to talk to Caleb again. If nothing else, I had to figure out how much he knew, and whether he was just as much a victim in this as I was. The next time I saw Caleb, it wasn't planned. I was walking home from the train station when I heard someone call my name. I turned around, and there he was, standing on the sidewalk like he'd been waiting for me. Caleb, I said, confused. What are you doing here? He shrugged, looking sheepish. Mom said you might be around here. I wanted to talk to you. I felt a flicker of irritation. Of course Cheryl had sent him to find me, but I kept my tone calm. What's up? He hesitated, shifting awkwardly on his feet. Look, I know Mom's been weird lately, and I know she probably pissed you off. But I just wanted to say, whatever's going on between you two, it's not my fault, okay? The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Caleb, I never said it was your fault. Yeah, but it feels like it is, he said, his voice cracking. Mom's freaking out all the time, Greg's ignoring me, and now you're mad at her. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I felt my heart break a little. Caleb was just a kid caught in the middle of a mess he didn't create. And as much as I wanted to stay mad at Cheryl, I couldn't take it out on him. Listen, I said gently, I'm not mad at you. None of this is your fault. But you need to be honest with me, okay? Has your mom told you what's really going on? He hesitated, then shook his head. Not really. She just says Greg's being a jerk and we're broke. She keeps saying we'll figure it out, but I don't know. It feels like she's hiding something. I nodded, trying to process everything. Cheryl was clearly keeping Caleb in the dark about her schemes, which only made me angrier. But before I could say anything else, Caleb said something that stopped me cold. She keeps saying it's all because of Dad. I blinked. What? She says Greg's mad about something Dad did before he died, and that's why he's trying to screw us over. I don't get it, though. What does Dad have to do with anything? My mind was racing. Was this the secret Cheryl had been dangling in front of me? Something about my dad? Or was it just another lie to cover her tracks? I couldn't tell anymore. After my conversation with Caleb, I knew I needed more answers and fast. So I called James again. If anyone could help me untangle this mess, it was him. When we met up, I laid everything out: the lawyer's call, Caleb's plea, and Cheryl's cryptic comments about my dad. James listened quietly, his brow furrowed in concentration. I don't know anything about your dad, he said finally. But if Cheryl's dragging him into this, it's probably because she thinks it'll guilt you into helping her. I sighed. That's what I thought too. But what if there's something real behind it? I mean, she's lied before, but she's never brought my dad into it like this. James looked at me for a long moment, then said, "There's one way to find out." That's when he dropped a bombshell of his own. Greg kept detailed financial records on everything, including Cheryl's spending. If Cheryl had been hiding something big, those records might have clues. And James, being the good old numbers guy that he was, still had contacts at the company who could get access to them. Are you sure this is a good idea? I asked, half excited, half terrified. James smirked. Probably not. But when has that ever stopped us? 2 days later, James called me with an update. He'd gotten his hands on some of Greg's records, and what he found left us both reeling. Apparently, Cheryl had been transferring money out of Greg's accounts and into a trust fund labeled under Caleb's name, a fund she had set up herself and managed entirely without Greg's direct oversight. This meant Cheryl had full control, using Caleb's name as a cover to funnel money into her own private accounts without raising suspicion. But here's the kicker. The trust fund wasn't for Caleb at all. The money was being funneled into Cheryl's private account. She'd been using her own son as a cover for embezzlement. It was the final piece of the puzzle, and the confirmation I needed. Cheryl wasn't just lying to me. She was lying to Caleb, too. And if I didn't do something, she'd drag him down with her. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to stop her. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't stop thinking about what James had uncovered. Cheryl had been stealing money under Caleb's name, essentially using her own son as a shield for her fraud. It made me sick to think about it, and even sicker to realize that Caleb had no idea. He trusted her. Despite all the chaos she brought into his life, he still believed she was doing her best for him. And now I had to figure out how to break the truth to him without completely shattering his world. But before I could even decide how to approach Caleb, Cheryl showed up at my apartment. Uninvited. I heard the knock on my door and wasn't expecting anyone, so I peeked through the peephole, and there she was. Cheryl, looking frazzled and out of place, standing in the hallway of my tiny apartment building. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home, but she must have sensed I was there because she called out, "Olivia, I know you're in there. Please, I need to talk to you." I sighed, opening the door but keeping the chain on. "What do you want, Cheryl?" Her eyes darted around nervously, and she dropped her voice to a whisper. "Can I come in? I don't want to do this out here." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I shut the door long enough to unhook the chain, then let her inside. She looked out of place in my cramped little living room, like she didn't quite know what to do with herself. It was almost funny, seeing her in my space, where she didn't have the upper hand for once. She wrung her hands, pacing a little. "I know you're still upset with me, but I need your help." I crossed my arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. "We've been through this already. I'm not giving you money, Cheryl." "It's not just about money," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. "It's about Caleb. He's all I have left, Olivia. If I lose him, if Greg takes him away from me, I don't know what I'll do." I narrowed my eyes. "Greg's not taking Caleb away from you. He's trying to protect him. And maybe he should, considering what you've been doing." Her face froze, just for a second, before she recovered. "What are you talking about?" "I know about the trust fund," I said coldly. "The one you've been siphoning money out of for yourself, using Caleb's name to cover your tracks. I know everything, Cheryl." The color drained from her face, and for a moment, I thought she might actually faint. But then she straightened up, her expression hardening. You don't understand. I had no choice. Greg. He's cutting us off, Olivia. I had to do something. Everything I've done has been to keep Caleb safe. I laughed bitterly. Safe? Are you kidding me? You're using him as a pawn in your schemes, and you're telling yourself it's for his benefit? Do you even hear yourself? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let myself feel sorry for her. Not this time. You don't get it, she said, her voice shaking. You think I'm the villain here, but I've been doing the best I can. Do you know how hard it's been, raising Caleb on my own? Greg doesn't care about him. He never has. And your father? She stopped abruptly, biting her lip. I tensed. What about my father? She looked away, her hands trembling. I didn't want to tell you this, but your father wasn't the man you thought he was. He made mistakes, Olivia. Big ones. And Greg found out about them. That's why he's doing this. He's punishing me for something your father did. I stared at her, my heart pounding. What the hell are you talking about? What mistakes? She hesitated, like she was weighing how much to tell me. Your father was involved in some bad business deals before he died. He borrowed money from people he shouldn't have, and when he couldn't pay it back, well, let's just say Greg had to clean up the mess. He agreed to help me keep things quiet, but now he's using it against me. He's threatening to tell Caleb everything if I don't back down. I didn't know what to believe. Cheryl was a master manipulator, and for all I knew, this was just another one of her lies. But there was a part of me, a small, nagging part, that wondered if there was some truth to her story. My dad had always been a little secretive about his finances, and after he died, Cheryl had taken control of everything. Had there been something more going on that I didn't know about? I don't believe you, I said finally, my voice cold. And even if it's true, it doesn't justify what you've done. You've lied to Caleb, you've stolen money, and you've dragged me into your mess. You don't get to play the victim here, Cheryl. She took a shaky breath, her tears spilling over now. I know I've made mistakes, but please, Olivia, I'm begging you, don't let Greg destroy what's left of my family. I stared at her, my emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted to tell her to get the hell out of my apartment and never come back. But then I thought about Caleb and the way he'd looked at me when he said he didn't know what to do. I couldn't just walk away, not yet. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice steady. You're going to tell Caleb the truth. All of it. About the money, about Greg, about Dad. Everything. If you don't, I will. Her eyes widened in panic. Olivia, please. I'm done covering for you, I said sharply. If you care about Caleb as much as you say you do, you'll stop lying to him. And if you don't, well, then I'll know exactly where your priorities are. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine, she whispered. I'll tell him. She left without another word, and as soon as the door closed behind her, I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. I didn't know if I'd done the right thing, but at least I'd finally drawn a line. Cheryl wasn't going to drag me down with her anymore. The next day, I waited anxiously to hear from Caleb. Cheryl had promised to tell him everything, but knowing her, I wasn't holding my breath. Part of me wondered if she'd even follow through or just keep stringing him and me along. Still, I decided to give her the chance to come clean. If she didn't, I was prepared to do it myself, no matter how much it hurt Caleb. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Caleb. Hey, can we talk? I think Mom told me some stuff I don't understand. My chest tightened as I read the message. I could only imagine what stuff Cheryl had told him, or how much of it was even true. I texted him back immediately and told him to come by my apartment. I needed to see him face to face. When Caleb showed up, he looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His usual quiet energy had been replaced with something more restless. His hands kept fidgeting, and he couldn't seem to make eye contact. I invited him in and offered him something to drink, but he just shook his head and sat down on the edge of the couch. She told me, he said, his voice low, about the money, about everything. I sat down across from him, trying to read his expression. What exactly did she tell you? He let out a bitter laugh. That she's been lying to me for years. That Greg's not the bad guy, and she's the one who's been screwing everything up. She said she only did it because she was scared we'd lose everything. But, he trailed off, shaking his head. I don't even know what to believe anymore. I leaned forward, my heart breaking for him. Caleb, I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve any of this. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. Is it true? About Dad? I froze. What did she say about Dad? She said he left us in debt, that Greg had to step in and help her clean up the mess after he died. She claimed some of the debts were tied to shared assets, like the house and a small business my dad had co-owned, or to private loans from people my dad shouldn't have trusted. According to her, these creditors didn't care that my dad was gone. They wanted their money, and Cheryl became their next target. And that's why Greg hates her now, because she kept taking more money to try to fix it. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. So Cheryl had told him at least part of the truth. But I couldn't tell if she was using my dad as a scapegoat to justify her own actions, or if there was actually more to the story than I realized. Listen, I said carefully, I don't know the full story about Dad. I know he wasn't perfect, and maybe he did make some mistakes. But that doesn't excuse what Cheryl's done. She's been lying to you, to both of us, and that's not okay. Caleb looked down at his hands, his jaw clenched. I don't even know who she is anymore. For the next hour, we talked through everything. I told Caleb about the trust fund, about Cheryl's manipulations, and even about the lawyer's warning. He listened quietly, nodding every so often, but saying very little. By the time we were done, he looked exhausted, like the weight of everything was finally sinking in. What am I supposed to do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to figure it all out right now, I said gently. But you don't have to go through this alone, either. I'm here for you, Caleb, no matter what happens. He gave me a small, grateful smile, and for the first time, I felt like we were actually connecting as siblings. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That night, I got a call from James. He'd been following up on some of the financial records we'd found, and he discovered something new, something that changed everything. Olivia, he said, his tone urgent. I found a separate account under Cheryl's name. It's been active for years, and she's been funneling money into it from multiple sources. But here's the kicker. Some of the deposits came from a third party. Someone who isn't Greg. I frowned. What do you mean? Who's the third party? It's hard to say, James said. The records don't list a name, just a shell company. But it looks like Cheryl's been getting payments from them regularly, like clockwork. And the amounts aren't small. My mind raced. If Cheryl was getting money from someone else, why was she still so desperate? What was she using the money for? And more importantly, who was paying her, and why? I think you need to confront her, James said. If she's hiding something bigger, this might be your chance to get the truth. The next morning, I called Cheryl and told her to meet me at a diner near her house. She didn't argue, which surprised me. Maybe she realized she didn't have much leverage left. When she walked in, she looked worse than ever. Her usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that made her look smaller somehow. She slid into the booth across from me, avoiding my gaze. What is this about? She asked quietly. I didn't waste time. Who's been paying you? Cheryl? Who's behind the shell company? Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, I said, my voice cold. We found the records. Someone's been giving you money, and it's not Greg. Who are they? Cheryl? And what are they paying you for? Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table. You don't understand, she whispered. I had no choice. Then explain it to me, I demanded. Because right now, it looks like you've been lying to everyone, including Caleb, and I want to know why. And you should know that I've spoken to people who understand this kind of thing, lawyers, accountants. They're helping me figure out what's really going on, so you might want to start telling the truth. She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. It's complicated. Try me. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she broke down. The money it was to pay off debts. Your father's debts. After he died, people came after me. Dangerous people. They weren't ordinary creditors. They were private lenders who operated outside the law. Loan sharks. When I couldn't pay them back, they started threatening me and Caleb. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know what else to do. I frowned, trying to make sense of her words. What kind of debts? Who are these people? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't want to know. Trust me, Olivia. You don't want to get involved. I did what I had to do to keep Caleb safe. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to the story. Something she still wasn't telling me. And I wasn't going to stop until I found out the truth.